"Ma'am, you need to step back." The command cut through the hushed courtroom with the sharp certainty of someone who had never expected to be questioned. Every conversation stopped. Every chair seemed to freeze in place. Even the old ceiling fan, lazily circling above polished oak benches, felt as though it had slowed to witness what would happen next. The woman standing near the front row did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked toward an elderly witness who was struggling to steady himself against the wooden railing. Her calm expression carried no fear, only quiet concern. "He just needs a moment," she said softly. "Please let him catch his breath." Officer Daniel Mercer frowned. To him, the woman looked like another visitor who had wandered too close to official business. She wore a charcoal gray coat that had clearly seen better days, sensible low heels, and carried a worn leather briefcase with softened edges. There was nothing about her appearance that suggested authority. No security detail, no assistant, no polished entourage, just a composed black woman who seemed oddly unbothered by the tension surrounding her. Mercer had spent 15 years believing hesitation invited disorder. Every courtroom followed rules. Every person had a place. And in his mind, strangers who questioned officers rarely belonged where they stood. "I said step back," he repeated, louder this time. Heads turned across the gallery. Attorneys paused over legal pads. A court reporter lifted her eyes from the keyboard. The elderly witness looked frightened enough to lose his balance, and the woman instinctively reached out, not to interfere, only to help him steady himself. Mercer immediately moved between them, convinced she was disrupting proceedings. A ripple of whispers spread across the room like wind across still water. Nobody knew her name. Nobody seemed willing to speak for her. The woman lowered her hand without complaint. Her breathing remained even. Her shoulders stayed relaxed. It was almost unsettling how composed she appeared while every eye settled on her. Mercer interpreted that calm as defiance. "This is your final warning," he declared. The silence that followed felt heavier than the marble walls surrounding them. Sunlight filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long golden rectangles across the floor where generations of lawyers had walked before. Dust drifted lazily through the beams of light, untouched by the growing unease. Somewhere near the back, someone quietly whispered that the officer should simply let the witness sit down. Someone else answered that procedures existed for a reason. The room divided itself without anyone standing up. The woman never joined either side. She simply waited. Then, in one brief, misguided moment born from assumption rather than understanding, Mercer reacted in a way that instantly transformed the atmosphere of the courtroom. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. No shouting followed. No chaos erupted. The woman neither lashed out nor argued. She adjusted the strap of her weathered briefcase, calmly smoothed the sleeve of her coat, and looked directly at the officer with eyes so steady they seemed untouched by embarrassment or anger. For the first time since entering the courtroom that morning, Mercer hesitated. There was something about the way she carried herself that no uniform could explain. It was dignity without performance, confidence without arrogance. As the courthouse clock quietly marked the hour, a side door near the judge's chambers opened with a slow, deliberate click. A bailiff stepped into the room, scanned the gallery for only a fraction of a second, and spoke with unmistakable respect. "Your Honor," he said clearly, "the court is ready for you." A hush settled over the courtroom so completely that even the faint scratching of the court reporter's keyboard came to an abrupt stop. Officer Daniel Mercer slowly turned toward the side entrance, confusion replacing the certainty that had filled his expression only seconds earlier. The bailiff remained perfectly still, his posture formal, his attention fixed not on the officer, not on the attorneys, but on the woman with the weathered briefcase. She acknowledged him with the slightest nod before walking forward at an unhurried pace. Every step echoed softly across the polished hardwood floor. Nobody spoke. Nobody seemed willing to interrupt the strange silence unfolding before them. The elderly witness she had tried to assist watched with wide eyes, his trembling hands now resting safely against the railing. The young associate seated near the prosecution table quietly removed his glasses as if he believed clearer vision might somehow explain what he was witnessing. Ava Brooks reached the small doorway leading toward the private judicial corridor, then paused for only a moment. She carefully placed one hand on the brass handle, glanced back across the courtroom, and met the eyes of several people who had silently judged her only minutes earlier. There was no resentment in her expression, no satisfaction, only quiet composure. Beyond the doorway, the atmosphere shifted completely. The sounds of public proceedings faded behind thick oak walls, replaced by the muted rhythm of courthouse staff preparing another day of hearings. A judicial clerk greeted her with a warm smile. "Good morning, Judge Brooks. We have updated the docket exactly as you requested." Ava thanked her with genuine kindness before setting her worn briefcase on a polished walnut table. The old leather looked almost out of place beside the carefully organized legal files waiting for her review. She opened it slowly, revealing neatly arranged case folders, handwritten notes, and a family photograph tucked carefully inside the front pocket. The picture showed a younger Ava standing beside her late father outside a small brick courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama. He had spent more than 30 years working as a public defender, often reminding his daughter that justice was measured not by titles, but by the dignity shown to people who possessed none. Those words had stayed with her through every difficult year that followed. Long before earning a judicial appointment, Ava had represented families who could barely afford legal counsel. She had driven hundreds of miles across rural counties, visited community centers after long court days, and accepted cases many prestigious firms politely declined. She believed that respect should never depend upon wealth, clothing, or social status. That belief explained why she often arrived without ceremony, preferring to enter the courthouse exactly as ordinary citizens did. It allowed her to see how people were treated before anyone recognized the robe they would soon wear. Outside, uncertainty spread across the courtroom. Whispered conversations grew louder with every passing second. One attorney quietly searched the state's judicial appointment announcements on his tablet. Another suddenly recognized the name listed beside that morning's docket and felt his stomach tighten. Officer Mercer remained near the front of the room, replaying every word he had spoken since the woman first arrived. Confidence slowly gave way to uneasy reflection. For the first time in many years, he questioned not whether he had followed procedure, but whether he had mistaken authority for fairness. Behind the closed chamber door, Ava carefully slipped on the black judicial robe hanging beside her desk. The fabric settled naturally across her shoulders, simple and unadorned, carrying no symbol except the responsibility it represented. She looked into the mirror only briefly before gathering her notes. Her breathing remained steady. The same calm presence that had followed her through the public entrance would now accompany her to the highest seat in the courtroom, where every decision would carry the weight of the law rather than the assumptions of strangers. The heavy courtroom doors opened once again, and every person inside rose almost instinctively. The conversations disappeared as though they had never existed. Judge Ava Brooks entered with measured confidence, the black robe flowing gently with each step until she reached the elevated bench. The polished walnut reflected the morning sunlight pouring through the tall courthouse windows, surrounding her with a quiet dignity that needed no announcement. She placed her leather briefcase beside the clerk's station instead of handing it to anyone else, a habit she had never abandoned despite years on the bench. The clerk smiled respectfully while arranging the morning calendar, and the bailiff waited silently for her signal to begin. Across the room, Officer Daniel Mercer remained frozen where he stood. The certainty that had once defined his posture had completely vanished. He stared toward the bench, searching the judge's face for anger, disappointment, or even satisfaction, but found none of them. Ava's expression remained remarkably calm, as though the uncomfortable moments from only minutes earlier belonged to another day entirely. That quiet restraint unsettled him far more than any harsh reaction ever could. The attorneys exchanged uneasy glances. Several had heard rumors that the state's newest judicial appointment preferred arriving through the public entrance whenever possible. Few had believed the stories. Fewer still understood why. One senior defense attorney leaned toward a younger colleague and whispered that Judge Brooks had built a reputation for evaluating not only legal arguments, but also the character revealed before proceedings officially began. Respect, she often said, was easiest to perform when everyone important was watching. True character appeared long before titles were recognized. The courtroom suddenly felt much smaller than before. Mercer lowered his eyes for the first time in years. His service record had always reflected discipline, efficiency, and unquestioned confidence. Supervisors praised his professionalism. Younger officers admired his command presence. Yet buried inside his personnel file were several citizen complaints that never developed into formal discipline because evidence remained inconclusive. None had threatened his career, but each described the same concern. People often felt dismissed before they were heard. At the time, Mercer convinced himself those complaints came from individuals who simply disliked authority. Standing in front of Judge Brooks, that explanation suddenly felt incomplete. Ava opened the first case file with careful precision. The pages rested perfectly aligned before her. She adjusted her reading glasses, glanced briefly across both counsel tables, and greeted everyone with the same measured courtesy regardless of position or status. Her voice carried warmth without sacrificing authority. Every sentence sounded deliberate, every word chosen with remarkable care. The elderly witness she had tried to help earlier looked toward her with visible relief, recognizing the same kindness now carried into the highest seat in the room. Even the jurors waiting outside the courtroom could hear the calm confidence in her opening remarks as the sound echoed gently through the hallway. Mercer listened in silence. The memory of his assumptions replayed again and again inside his mind. He realized he had judged clothing before character, appearance before conduct, and familiarity before truth. Nothing in his training manual had instructed him to make those choices. They had come from somewhere much deeper, somewhere he had never bothered to examine. As the courthouse clock quietly marked another passing minute, sunlight continued to spread across the polished floor between the officer and the bench, creating a bright path neither of them could ignore. One stood wearing a badge that represented public trust. The other wore a robe carrying the responsibility of justice itself. Only one of them had entered the building that morning determined to see every person before making a judgment. The first hearing began with the quiet rhythm that usually settled over a courtroom once formalities ended. Papers turned softly. Pens moved across yellow legal pads. The air carried the faint scent of old wood polished over decades and fresh coffee drifting in from the clerk's office down the hallway. Judge Ava Brooks listened carefully as both attorneys presented their opening arguments, never interrupting, never rushing, allowing every sentence the space it deserved. Her questions were concise, thoughtful, and remarkably even-handed. Within minutes, even the lawyers who had entered with quiet skepticism recognized the depth of her preparation. Every citation was familiar. Every procedural detail rested effortlessly in her memory. She had clearly studied every page long before anyone else entered the building. Officer Daniel Mercer remained assigned near the courtroom entrance, standing with disciplined posture even though his thoughts refused to remain steady. He found himself watching the proceedings with unusual attention. The woman he had mistaken for an ordinary visitor demonstrated complete command of every legal issue raised before her. She never spoke louder than necessary. She never attempted to intimidate anyone. Yet the entire room responded to her with effortless respect. It was authority earned rather than demanded, and Mercer slowly realized he had rarely considered the difference. Midway through the hearing, the elderly witness from earlier was called to testify. The man carefully approached the witness stand, moving with cautious steps that reflected both age and nervousness. Judge Brooks immediately noticed his unsteady breathing. She glanced toward the clerk before speaking with calm sincerity. "Take your time, sir. The court is interested in accurate testimony, not hurried testimony." The witness smiled gratefully and nodded. The atmosphere softened almost immediately. Jurors leaned forward with renewed attention, sensing that patience rather than pressure would guide the morning. As testimony continued, one of the attorneys attempted to interrupt repeatedly, hoping to push the witness into shorter answers. Judge Brooks gently raised one hand. "Counsel, everyone who appears before this court deserves the opportunity to answer without unnecessary interruption. We will maintain that standard today." Her voice remained composed, but there was unmistakable firmness beneath every word. The attorney immediately apologized and stepped back. Mercer watched the exchange with growing discomfort. Only an hour earlier, he had believed efficiency required control above all else. Yet the courtroom now moved more smoothly precisely because its highest authority had chosen restraint instead of force. Nothing about Judge Brooks suggested weakness. On the contrary, every decision strengthened the confidence of those around her. The court reporter typed with renewed rhythm. The jurors listened more carefully. Even the witness's voice became steadier as the questioning continued. During a brief recess, the chief bailiff quietly approached the bench with a sealed envelope marked confidential. Judge Brooks thanked him before opening it. Inside was an internal memorandum confirming that courthouse security supervisors had already begun reviewing the unexpected incident that had occurred before the session opened. Standard policy required documentation whenever conduct inside the courthouse raised concerns about professional behavior. Ava read the page without changing her expression. She folded the memorandum neatly, returned it to the envelope, and placed it beneath her case files. She neither commented nor looked toward Officer Mercer. The decision surprised the clerk seated beside her. Many judges would have addressed the matter immediately. Instead, Judge Brooks chose to finish the day's work before considering anything personal. Justice, she believed, should never become emotional simply because emotions were understandable. Across the courtroom, Mercer noticed the envelope but could not read its contents. A quiet weight settled over him nonetheless. He understood enough about courthouse procedure to know that official reviews rarely began without reason. For the first time in his career, uncertainty replaced confidence. Yet what unsettled him most was not the possibility of consequences. It was the realization that the person with every opportunity to embarrass him publicly had instead devoted her full attention to the people who had come seeking justice, proving through quiet actions that true integrity was measured not by how power was displayed, but by how carefully it was restrained. By late afternoon, the courthouse had settled into the steady rhythm that always followed a demanding calendar. The bright morning sunlight had softened into long amber reflections stretching across the marble floor, and the quiet hum of air vents filled the pauses between each proceeding. Judge Ava Brooks completed another hearing with the same careful attention she had shown since taking the bench that morning. Every ruling rested on facts. Every explanation was delivered with patience, and every person who stood before her left knowing they had been heard. That simple consistency slowly transformed the atmosphere inside the courtroom. People who had arrived anxious spoke more calmly. Attorneys argued their cases with greater professionalism. Even disagreements seemed less personal beneath the steady balance she maintained. Officer Daniel Mercer noticed every detail, and each observation weighed more heavily than the one before it. The confidence that had once defined his every movement had quietly given way to reflection. During a brief recess, he stepped into the nearly empty hallway outside the courtroom. The polished stone walls reflected the fading afternoon light, while framed portraits of former judges lined the corridor, each face seeming to observe the silence around him. He stopped beside one of the tall windows overlooking the courthouse steps, watching families, attorneys, and ordinary citizens come and go. For years he had believed his responsibility ended with maintaining order. Now he found himself wondering whether order without understanding could ever truly serve justice. His thoughts were interrupted when the chief of courthouse security approached with a calm but unmistakably serious expression. "Officer Mercer, internal professional standards would like to speak with you after the final session today." The words were spoken without accusation, yet they carried undeniable weight. Mercer acknowledged the request with a quiet nod. He had attended administrative interviews before as a witness, but never as the subject of a review. He understood the process well enough to know that assumptions would not matter there. Facts would. Inside the courtroom, Judge Brooks continued reviewing case files while the clerk organized the final docket. She noticed the chief security officer speaking with Mercer through the partially open door, but immediately returned her attention to the documents before her. She neither asked questions nor allowed curiosity to interfere with her responsibilities. The law required fairness not only for those seeking relief, but also for those whose actions were under examination. That principle had guided every stage of her career, and she refused to abandon it now simply because the circumstances had become personal. As the final hearing concluded, members of the public slowly filtered toward the exits. Several paused to thank the judge for treating every witness with respect regardless of background or education. One elderly woman smiled warmly before saying, "People remember how you make them feel long after they forget legal words." Ava returned the smile with quiet gratitude. Those simple moments had always mattered more to her than recognition or prestige. Meanwhile, Mercer remained standing near the courtroom entrance, Watching ordinary citizens leave with renewed confidence in a system he suddenly realized could be either strengthened or weakened by the smallest decisions made inside its walls. He replayed the beginning of the day once more, recognizing details he had ignored in the moment. The calm voice, the concern for an elderly witness, the absence of anger. None of those qualities had matched the assumptions he carried into the encounter. As the courthouse clock struck 5, the final echo lingered through the nearly empty halls. Judge Brooks carefully placed the last signed order inside its case folder before closing her worn leather briefcase. At almost the same moment, Mercer received a quiet request to report to the administrative conference room on the second floor. Neither of them spoke as they left the courtroom by separate doors, yet both understood that the next conversation would not be about status, appearance, or first impressions. It would be about character, accountability, and whether justice possessed the courage to examine everyone by the very standards it expected them to uphold. The administrative conference room overlooked the western side of the courthouse where the last light of the day stretched across the city in long bands of gold and copper. The bustle that had filled the hallways only an hour earlier had faded into distant footsteps and the occasional closing door. Inside the room, the atmosphere was remarkably quiet. A polished oak table stood beneath a row of framed photographs honoring decades of judges, clerks, and public servants who had devoted their lives to the rule of law. Officer Daniel Mercer sat alone at one end of the table, his uniform still perfectly pressed, yet for the first time in many years it no longer felt like armor. He rested his hands together and stared toward the window where the reflection of the courthouse appeared softer than the stone building itself. The silence gave him something he had spent years avoiding. Time to think. Every decision from the morning replayed with uncomfortable clarity. He remembered the elderly witness struggling to remain steady. He remembered the calm voice asking only for patience. He remembered how quickly he had decided who belonged and who did not. The realization settled over him with unexpected weight. None of those choices had been required by policy. They had come from habits he had never questioned because they had never been challenged. Down the hallway, Judge Ava Brooks finished signing the final documents of the day before carefully placing each file into its proper folder. She thanked the courtroom clerk for staying late and wished the maintenance staff a safe evening as they prepared the courtroom for the next morning. She moved through the nearly empty building with the same quiet grace that had marked every hour of her first day on the bench. When she passed the large windows facing the courthouse plaza, she paused for a brief moment. Outside, the American flag moved gently in the evening breeze while the courthouse steps slowly emptied beneath the fading sky. She remembered standing on those same steps years earlier beside her father after he had lost a difficult case, defending a man who could not afford private counsel. He had looked at the courthouse and smiled despite the disappointment. "The law is strongest," he had told her. "When the people serving it remember they are human before they remember their titles." Those words had shaped every decision she had made since then. They shaped this moment as well. A courthouse employee quietly informed her that the administrative review had begun. Ava acknowledged the update with a simple thank you, but asked for no additional information. She believed every review deserved independence, free from influence, especially when her own experience was connected to the facts being examined. Across the building, Mercer remained seated as members of the Professional Standards Office reviewed reports, security camera recordings, and written statements collected throughout the day. No voices were raised. No accusations echoed through the room. The process moved deliberately, guided by evidence instead of emotion. Waiting became more difficult than any immediate answer could have been. Through the conference room window, Mercer watched the courthouse lights gradually illuminate one by one as daylight disappeared. The glowing windows reflected across the polished stone plaza like quiet reminders that justice continued long after public attention faded. For the first time in his career, he understood that accountability was not the enemy of service. It was the foundation that allowed public trust to exist at all. In another part of the courthouse, Judge Brooks picked up her weathered leather briefcase and turned off the lamp in her chambers. The room fell into gentle shadow except for the last rays of evening filtering through the blinds. She took one final look at the empty courtroom before closing the door behind her, knowing that tomorrow would bring new cases, new people, and new opportunities to prove that true authority was never measured by how loudly it demanded respect, but by how faithfully it offered fairness even when no one was watching. Morning arrived beneath a pale blue sky that reflected across the courthouse windows like polished glass. The building felt quieter than usual, yet beneath that calm surface important decisions were already taking shape. Members of the Professional Standards Office gathered inside a secure conference room with neatly organized files spread across the long oak table. They reviewed written statements, courthouse security logs, and footage recorded by multiple cameras positioned throughout the public entrance and courtroom corridor. Every angle revealed the same sequence of events from a different perspective. No single image told the entire story, but together they formed a picture impossible to dismiss. The recordings showed Judge Ava Brooks entering through the public entrance exactly as countless citizens did every day. They showed her stopping only because an elderly witness appeared unsteady. They showed her speaking with calm restraint, never raising her voice, never refusing a lawful instruction, never creating a disturbance. Most striking of all was what happened after the misunderstanding. Instead of responding with anger or demanding immediate recognition, she quietly continued toward her chambers and prepared to preside over the day's proceedings with complete professionalism. One investigator paused the footage and looked around the room before saying softly, "She had every opportunity to make this about herself. She never did." The observation lingered in the silence that followed. Officer Daniel Mercer sat across the table listening as each fact replaced the assumptions that had once seemed unquestionable. He did not interrupt. He did not search for excuses. Watching the recordings from the detached perspective of a camera forced him to confront something deeply uncomfortable. The woman he had judged so quickly had demonstrated more patience in a few minutes than he had shown throughout the entire encounter. His attention shifted toward another folder placed near the center of the table. It contained several earlier citizen complaints submitted over the past few years. None had resulted in formal discipline, yet together they revealed a consistent pattern. Different neighborhoods, different individuals, different circumstances. The language changed from report to report, but one sentence appeared with striking similarity. People often felt they had been dismissed before they were understood. Mercer slowly lowered his eyes. Reading those words together carried a different weight than seeing each complaint in isolation. He realized the pattern had existed long before anyone else recognized it. He simply had not wanted to see it. Across the courthouse, Judge Ava Brooks arrived early once again, carrying the same weathered leather briefcase through the public entrance. Several courthouse employees greeted her warmly, but she returned each greeting with the same humility she had shown throughout her career. She stopped briefly to help a maintenance worker hold open a heavy door while a cart of cleaning supplies rolled safely across the hallway. The worker thanked her with a smile that held no awareness of the administrative review taking place elsewhere in the building. Ava preferred it that way. Every act of courtesy mattered most when it expected nothing in return. Shortly afterward, the chief administrator requested a brief meeting in his office. He informed Judge Brooks that the preliminary review had concluded and confirmed that the findings would proceed according to established policy without outside influence. Ava simply nodded. "Everyone deserves a fair process," she replied. "That includes those who make mistakes." The administrator studied her for a moment before quietly admitting that not everyone in her position would have answered that way. She offered only a gentle smile before returning to the courtroom. Back inside the conference room, the final report was placed on the table. The conclusions did not rely on emotion, reputation, or public opinion. They rested entirely upon evidence, professional standards, and the expectation that every public servant would treat every citizen with equal dignity. Mercer signed the acknowledgement form with a steady hand, although his heart felt heavier than it ever had beneath the weight of his badge. For the first time, he understood that the greatest turning point in his career had not been caused by punishment. It had begun the moment one quiet act of grace exposed everything his assumptions had prevented him from seeing. The courthouse resumed its familiar rhythm over the following week, yet something invisible had changed within its walls. Conversations became more thoughtful. Greetings lasted a little longer. Small acts of courtesy that once passed unnoticed now seemed to carry unexpected meaning. Officer Daniel Mercer returned to duty under the conditions established by the administrative review, determined to rebuild the trust that could no longer be assumed simply because he wore a badge. Every interaction demanded greater patience than before. Every decision required him to pause long enough to see the individual standing in front of him rather than the assumptions already forming inside his mind. It was not an easy habit to change, but for the first time he understood that lasting respect was earned one choice at a time. Late one afternoon, after the final hearing had concluded, Mercer quietly approached the courtroom while Judge Ava Brooks organized the last of her case files. The gallery had nearly emptied, leaving only the soft sound of the ventilation system and the fading sunlight stretching across the polished floor. The courtroom that had witnessed misunderstanding now stood wrapped in peaceful silence. Mercer removed his cap before speaking. For several moments, no words came. The confidence that had once filled every sentence had been replaced by careful honesty. "Your Honor," he finally said, "I owe you an apology that should have been offered much sooner." Ava looked up from the open file resting before her and gave him her full attention. She did not interrupt. She did not rescue him from the discomfort of speaking difficult truths. She simply listened. Mercer continued with quiet sincerity. "I believed I was protecting order, but I failed to see the person standing in front of me. I judged before I understood. That was my responsibility, not yours. I cannot change that morning, but I can change the officer I become after it." His voice remained steady, yet every word carried the weight of genuine reflection rather than obligation. The apology filled the empty courtroom with a different kind of silence, one created not by fear, but by honesty. Judge Brooks closed the file and folded her hands gently upon the bench. Her expression remained calm, just as it had been from the beginning. "Officer Mercer," she replied softly, "every profession built on public trust depends upon people who are willing to examine themselves. Accountability is never comfortable, but it is often where integrity begins." She paused briefly before continuing. "The purpose of justice is not simply to identify mistakes. It is to ensure they become lessons instead of patterns." Mercer listened without lowering his eyes. Those words carried no bitterness and no triumph. They sounded like the same principles that had guided every decision she had made since entering the courthouse through the public doors. He nodded slowly, understanding that forgiveness did not erase responsibility. Instead, it created the opportunity to honor it. Before leaving, Judge Brooks stepped down from the bench and extended her hand. Mercer accepted the gesture with quiet gratitude. There was no celebration, no audience waiting to applaud, and no dramatic declaration to erase the past. There was only a simple moment between two public servants who now understood that authority meant very little without humility. As they walked towards separate exits, the elderly witness from the earlier hearing happened to pass through the hallway. He recognized them both, smiled warmly, and thanked each of them for serving the community. Neither corrected him. Both understood that the greatest victories inside any courthouse were rarely found in headlines or verdicts alone. They were found in ordinary moments when people chose understanding over pride, fairness over assumption, and character over appearance. The fading evening light followed them through the courthouse doors, leaving behind a building that seemed just a little brighter than it had been only a few days before. Several months later, the courthouse stood beneath the clear light of an early autumn morning, its stone columns glowing softly as the first rays of sunlight reached the front steps. The familiar sound of footsteps echoed through the entrance as attorneys greeted clerks by name. Families waited patiently for hearings, and courthouse employees carried stacks of files from one office to another. Nothing about the building appeared extraordinary, yet those who worked there understood that something meaningful had quietly changed. Respect had become part of the culture rather than a reminder written inside policy manuals. Officer Daniel Mercer now greeted every visitor with the same calm courtesy regardless of appearance, clothing, or circumstance. He listened before speaking. He asked questions before reaching conclusions. Younger officers occasionally wondered why he insisted on taking a few extra moments with people who seemed anxious or confused. He always answered with the same simple response: "You cannot protect someone you refuse to understand." Those words spread through the department more effectively than any formal training session. Judge Ava Brooks continued arriving through the public entrance whenever her schedule allowed. She still carried the same weathered leather briefcase, still paused to hold doors for courthouse employees, and still greeted the maintenance staff with the same genuine warmth she offered attorneys and elected officials. Many first-time visitors never realized she was the presiding judge until they later saw her take the bench. By then, they had already experienced the quiet humility that defined her long before any title did. One crisp morning, the elderly witness whose unsteady steps had unknowingly changed so many lives returned to the courthouse to observe a community outreach program organized for local high school students. As he watched Judge Brooks explain the importance of equal justice under the law, he noticed Officer Mercer welcoming every student with patience and encouragement. The contrast between that day and the morning of their first meeting could not have been greater. The witness smiled quietly, realizing that real change rarely announced itself with dramatic speeches. It revealed itself through ordinary habits repeated every single day. After the program ended, the students gathered outside beneath a row of maple trees whose leaves drifted gently across the courthouse plaza. One young girl paused before leaving and asked Judge Brooks what had inspired her to become a judge. Ava looked toward the courthouse doors for a brief moment before answering with quiet sincerity. Every person deserves to be seen before they are judged. If we remember that, the law becomes stronger for everyone. The student thanked her and walked away carrying those words with thoughtful silence. From across the plaza, Mercer heard the conversation without interrupting. He understood that the lesson had become part of his own life as well. As the afternoon sun settled lower across the city skyline, the courthouse clock marked another ordinary day of public service. Families returned home. Attorneys closed their briefcases. Courtroom lights gradually dimmed one by one until only the warm glow from Judge Brooks's chambers remained visible through the tall windows. She gathered her papers, carefully placed the old family photograph back inside her leather briefcase, and turned off the desk lamp before stepping into the quiet hallway. Mercer was finishing his shift near the entrance. Their eyes met for only a moment, and they exchanged a simple nod before continuing in opposite directions. No words were necessary. The marble floors reflected the fading light. The American flag moved gently in the evening breeze beyond the courthouse steps, and the building settled once again into peaceful silence. Long after the doors closed for the night, the most important judgment rendered there was not recorded inside any official transcript. It lived instead in the quiet decision to meet every human being with dignity first, because kindness was never a sign of weakness. It was the truest measure of strength.